4 days after USS Indianapolis vanished beneath the Pacific, an American pilot looked down and saw hundreds of men scattered across the ocean, fighting to stay alive. Nearly 1,200 men had been aboard the cruiser. When rescuers finally arrived, only 316 survivors remained. The rest were gone. For days, these men had been drifting in open water. No ship, no rescue team, almost no fresh water. And beneath them, something was moving through the darkness. But the shocks were not the most terrifying part of the story. The most terrifying part was this. For days, the United States Navy did not even realize that USS Indianapolis was missing. So how could one of America's most important warships disappear without an immediate rescue? To understand that night, we have to go back to the beginning, July 1945. The war in the Pacific was entering its final and most dangerous stage. American forces were advancing toward Japan. The fighting had already devastated islands across the Pacific, and yet, the end of the war was still not certain. USS Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser of the United States Navy. She was fast, heavily armed, and battle-tested. Her crew had already seen some of the fiercest fighting of the Pacific War. They trusted their ship, they trusted their training, and most importantly, they believed they would eventually make it home. On July 16th, Indianapolis left San Francisco. The mission was unusual. The ship was carrying an extremely sensitive cargo to the Pacific island of Tinian. Most of the sailors aboard did not know exactly what they were carrying. They only knew the cargo had to arrive quickly. The Indianapolis reached Tinian on July 26th. Its secret cargo was delivered. The mission had been completed. The ship then continued to Guam. For the crew, it may have seemed that the most dangerous part of the voyage was already behind them. They were wrong. Indianapolis received orders to sail from Guam toward Leyte in the Philippines. The voyage was expected to be relatively routine. There was no reason for the crew to believe that the ship would never reach its destination. But waiting somewhere in the Philippine Sea was a Japanese submarine. The submarine was I-58. Its commander was Mochitsura Hashimoto. The submarine was hunting for Allied ships. Japan was losing the war, but Japanese submarines were still dangerous. And Hashimoto was searching for a target. The night of July 30th was dark. USS Indianapolis was moving through the Philippine Sea. The ship was traveling at speed. Some sailors were working, others were resting, some were asleep. No general alarm had been sounded. There was no obvious sign of danger. But beneath the waves, I-58 had detected the American cruiser. The Japanese submarine moved into position. Inside the submarine, the crew prepared their weapons. The target was large. The opportunity was clear. Hashimoto gave the order. Torpedoes were launched. They disappeared into the darkness beneath the surface. USS Indianapolis continued forward. The men aboard had no idea what was coming. Then suddenly, the ocean exploded. A torpedo slammed into Indianapolis. Then another. The explosions tore through the ship. Steel twisted. Compartments were destroyed. Water rushed inside. Men were thrown across the ship. In seconds, a routine voyage became a fight for survival. USS Indianapolis began to sink rapidly. There was almost no time. Some sailors never reached the deck. Others jumped into the ocean. Some were injured. Some had life jackets. Some had nothing. Then the massive cruiser disappeared beneath the Pacific. It had taken roughly 12 minutes. Nearly 1,000 men were suddenly in the water. There was no ship beneath their feet, no solid deck, no shelter, only the ocean. Many survivors were scattered across the surface in groups. Some clung to rafts, others held onto debris. Many depended entirely on their life jackets. The first night was terrifying. The survivors did not know whether help was coming. They could not see very far. They could hear men calling out in the darkness. Some were injured. Others were already too weak to stay afloat. But everyone was waiting for the same thing. a rescue ship. Then, the sun rose, and the survivors could finally see what had happened. Hundreds of men were scattered across the sea. Some were alive, others were not. The scale of the disaster became visible, but the survivors still believed rescue would come. Surely the Navy knew. Surely someone was looking for them. Hours passed. No ship appeared. The survivors watched the horizon. Nothing. No destroyer, no cruiser, no rescue aircraft. Only endless water. The first realization began to spread through the groups. Maybe nobody knew where they were. The heat became unbearable. The survivors were surrounded by water, yet almost none of it was safe to drink. Salt water would only make dehydration worse. Fresh water became more valuable than almost anything else. Every hour without it weakened the men further. During the day, the sun burned their exposed skin. Salt water covered their bodies. Some men were badly wounded. Others suffered from burns and exhaustion. There were no proper medical facilities, no hospital beds, no doctors with full equipment. They had only what they had managed to bring into the water. Then, the survivors began seeing fins. Sharks were entering the area. The smell of blood and the bodies in the water attracted predators. For men already exhausted and terrified, the sight was horrifying. The ocean was no longer simply the place where they were trying to survive. It had become another enemy. But something even more disturbing was happening far away. The Navy was not immediately aware that Indianapolis had been sunk. The ship had disappeared. Yet there was no immediate automatic rescue operation searching the surrounding sea. The survivors were waiting for help that had not even been sent. This silence would become one of the most controversial parts of the disaster. Indianapolis had been expected at Lady, but when the ship failed to arrive, the failure was not immediately treated as a confirmed sinking. Messages and tracking procedures failed to produce the response that might have saved lives, and the clock kept moving. The second day arrived. The survivors were becoming weaker. Some were unable to stay together. Groups began drifting apart. The ocean separated men who had fought together for years, and every hour increased the chances that another man would disappear beneath the waves. Dehydration began affecting the survivors' minds. Some became confused, others experienced hallucinations. The horizon seemed to change. Some thought they saw ships, some thought they saw land. But when they looked again, there was nothing. Only blue water stretching in every direction. Some men tried to keep their companions awake. They called each other's names. They talked about home. They talked about their families. They reminded one another that rescue had to come eventually. In a place where almost everything had been taken from them, hope became a weapon. The third day was worse. The heat continued. The dehydration continued. The injuries continued. And the sharks remained. Some survivors were now too weak to fight. Others were barely conscious. The men who remained alive were no longer simply waiting for rescue. They were fighting the ocean itself. Meanwhile, USS Indianapolis had become an absence in the Navy's records. The ship was overdue. But the warning signs had not immediately triggered a coordinated search. Several separate failures had occurred. No single mistake explained everything, but together, they created a deadly delay. Then, on August 2nd, something changed. A Navy aircraft was conducting a routine patrol. The pilot was Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn. Far below his aircraft, he noticed something unusual on the surface. At first, it looked like debris. Then he realized there were people in the water. Gwynn reported what he had seen. Other aircraft were sent toward the location. The scale of the tragedy quickly became clear. There were survivors everywhere, men who had been waiting for days, men who had almost given up. But the rescue had only just begun. Aircraft began circling above them. For the survivors, the sound of engines was almost unbelievable. After days of silence, there was finally proof that someone had found them. Some men waved, others could barely move. But they knew one thing. They had been seen. Ships were sent toward the survivors. Among them was USS Cecil J. Doyle. The ship raced toward the location. As rescuers approached, they began pulling exhausted men from the water, one by one, then another, and another. The survivors were given water, food, medical attention, blankets. For someone who had spent days exposed to the Pacific, these ordinary objects suddenly meant everything. Some survivors were too weak to speak. Others were simply relieved to be alive. But rescue crews also found bodies, hundreds of them. Some had died from their wounds, others from dehydration and exposure. Some had been attacked by sharks. The rescuers were witnessing the final result of 4 days of unimaginable suffering. Of approximately 1,195 men aboard USS Indianapolis, only 316 survivors were ultimately rescued. More than 800 men had died. It was one of the worst disasters in United States naval history, and it had happened just days before the war itself was about to end. There was a cruel irony. The ship had been carrying material connected to the atomic bomb that would soon be used against Japan. The Indianapolis completed that secret mission. But before the war ended, the ship itself was gone, and hundreds of American sailors would never know that victory was only days away. On August 15th, Japan announced its acceptance of the Allied terms of surrender. The Pacific War was effectively over. Across America, people celebrated. But for the families of Indianapolis sailors, there was little to celebrate. Their sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers were not coming home. Back home, families waited for news. Some received telegrams, some waited for confirmation. Others would spend years carrying questions that could never be completely answered. How did the ship disappear? Why wasn't it found sooner? Could more men have survived? Captain Charles B. McVeigh III survived the sinking. But surviving the ocean was not the end of his ordeal. He became the subject of a military court-martial. One issue was whether he had failed to maneuver the ship in a zigzag pattern to evade submarines. There was an extraordinary detail. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had attacked Indianapolis, later testified that zigzagging would not necessarily have prevented the attack. He had seen the cruiser, he had fired, and he believed he could have hit it regardless. The tragedy raised a difficult question. Was Captain McVeigh responsible? Were communication failures responsible? Were tracking procedures responsible? Should the Navy have recognized the missing ship sooner? The disaster was not caused by one simple mistake. It was a chain of failures. For the survivors, the memory never disappeared. They remembered the men who had died. They remembered the heat, the thirst, the darkness, the sharks, and the moment when rescue finally appeared. For many, the ocean was something they carried with them for the rest of their lives. Years after the war, Captain McVeigh continued to carry the burden of Indianapolis. In 1968, he died by suicide. His death brought renewed attention to the controversy surrounding his court-martial and the weight he had carried after the disaster. But the story was still not finished. Survivors continued to defend McVeigh. They argued that he had become the face of a disaster caused by failures much larger than one captain's decision. Their campaign continued for decades. Eventually, their efforts reached the United States Congress. In 2000, Congress passed a resolution concerning Captain McVeigh. The resolution stated that the evidence did not support the view that his actions had caused the sinking. For the survivors, it was an important moment. The story of Indianapolis had finally been reconsidered. For decades, the wreck of USS Indianapolis remained somewhere beneath the Pacific. Then, in 2017, an expedition led by Paul Allen located the wreck. More than 70 years after the sinking, Indianapolis had finally been found. The ship remained deep beneath the ocean. still resting where it had disappeared in 1945. Today, the story is not simply about a ship. It is about the men who were aboard her, about the 316 who survived, and about the hundreds who never returned home. They were sailors, they were Marines, they were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. Their final voyage became part of history. On the night of July 30th, 1945, USS Indianapolis was moving through the Pacific. 12 minutes later, the cruiser was gone. 4 days after that, only 316 men were pulled from the ocean alive. The war would end soon afterward. But for those men, the battle did not end when the guns fell silent. Because sometimes the most terrifying part of war is not the moment a ship is struck. It is what happens afterward, when thousands of miles of ocean stand between the survivors and the people who are supposed to come looking for them.